Witam Państwa na kolejnej sesji poświęconej
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome at the next session, which is developed to the development of HTA, and it will concern various aspects. We'll start with my presentation, which will be devoted to joint clinical assessment. Then, along with Jan Zygmuntowski and Marta Musiadłowska, who is in Belgium, will talk about the European perspective on the European space for health data. Then Michał Byliniak, who will present the development of perspective of HTA from the perspective of the industry. We just talked about controversial topics, as in HTA won't be necessary anymore. So this will be an example of implementing RWE and its practical use in Europe, a specific example of living, breathing projects and implementing it in decision-making. And the last presentation will be given by Clifford Goodman, who was recorded because in the States, it would be very early in the morning, like 4 a.m. So we decided to record his presentation. He will talk about how HTA was developing methodologically in Europe, and then we'll also be summing up and making reference to the first session. I hope we will get time to discuss a little bit. I can see that all the guests are coming back to us after the break. I also hope that the guests online are there. And if I can ask for the first set of slides. Joint clinical assessment is a process which was started over 20 years ago. I still remember I was told that I've been present on the market for 30 years. Well, it hasn't been that long, but it's been definitely 20 years. I remember an Australian event, a gala dinner, when we were arguing about when joint HTA will be implemented and whether it's possible to do it, to include also the economic analysis. I remember saying that it won't be possible, only a joint clinical assessment is possible because it is not possible to assess systems without sound data. So 20 years after, we are still discussing whether full HTA in the joint version can be implemented or only the clinical aspects. As you can see on this timeline, the projects have been going on for such a long time because the creation of a certain thing that would involve both the decision makers and analysts to create a cooperation, also to incorporate methodological aspects, I would consider it a big success of UNETA. Starting from 2003, the efforts have been going on. This is since 1999, we have been developing specific projects. First, there were like the preview projects, which would suggest that a network would be created. Was it possible to roll it out for the entire Europe? Not really, because the cooperation was mostly joined by Western European countries. From our part of Europe, we can see that this involvement was not as big as for the Western countries. But the regulation is a mandatory document which will force all countries across the EU to join the process. Why is it so important? Because the entry into force of the regulation forces the change of legislation in on the domestic level, on the national level, and this joint clinical assessment will have to be incorporated into the national legislations. It will become fact since January 2025. Why is it that important? Because clinical assessment understood as a systematical review and aspects relating to data analysis, all that will be of great importance because the methodology developed by UNETA is based on RCTs, so so trials with a control arm, but also involves the introduction of real-world evidence. This will be assessed by the member states, and we will soon know in which scope this real-world evidence assessment will be incorporated. I think it won't happen overnight. We'll be getting there gradually, because in some countries, for example, in NICE, they included the RWE assessments only 2 years ago. So we are still learning about this stuff. So this data still do not have, so the real-world evidence still don't have a big impact on the efficacy assessment or effectiveness assessment, more concerned with the safety aspects. So the assessment is a scientific assessment. So we'll be talking about aspects. We'll have a clinical assessment which will discuss the uncertainties, but when it comes to the strength of intervention and whether the countries want to reimburse the technology or not, that will be done on a national level. It's important because in the past, the assumption was that the joint clinical assessment will be the only one, and there won't be a clinical assessment on the national level. It will be otherwise in the end, because and on that basis, all the risk-sharing schemes, the economic analysis will be the domain of national countries, which results in a situation where, with regard to the creation of a health technology, when we look in Poland, the clinical assessment will be the starting point for a discussion. The competencies of member states do not also include a collection of data. So further studies can be performed on the European level, also collecting real-world evidence, which will allow for continued assessment of the technologies. It's important because systematic reviews will be carried out immediately after marketing authorization approval. So this gives ground to big challenges for the EU. Poland is one of the few countries in the region who have a full HTA assessment. And therefore, we are at the stage where the whole European Union is at the stage of learning how to implement it in practice. So, starting from 2025, each molecule which will be submitting a dossier to the EMA will be assessed in this model. They will be assessed in this model, and this will include a clinical assessment. It's important to say that analyses will also be submitted by the manufacturers. It's important that cancer drugs and advanced therapies are the first type of technologies to go. Around 50% of the currently registered molecules are cancer drugs, and they will be assessed in the first order. And then you can see in 2028, between 2025 and 2028, we have a trial period. If it fails, the regulation will undergo significant changes, because this transition period assumes that applications will be filed, but we also know that this process will be trialed in practice. So this is a big challenge, where we will be testing whether the current model that has been developed will be maintained. In 2028, we will add orphan drugs, and we also have medical devices, grade 2B and 3 medical devices, and in vitro products. So we'll have a different model for medical devices. And I would like to point out to one thing. Medical devices will also be assessed in the scope of digital. So AI and digital tools will be assessed as well. And here, a lot needs to be done on the EU level with regard to assessing digital tools. It's a huge challenge. Tomorrow in the morning, we'll be talking about the value framework presentation that will be discussed. A presentation from Australia will be presented on that topic. If we look at the process of registration, of obtaining marketing approval, so first, the dossier is submitted. So at day one, submission to the EMA launches the EU process of assessment. What does it mean? That a letter of intent is sent, and the first tests show us. We've already talked about PICO in the previous session, so population intervention, comparator, and outcomes. So this is the issue of scoping. This scoping will be collected from countries. However, it turned out that a lot of countries are not responding. If a lot of countries fail to provide the data, we won't be able to proceed. So we decided to change the process. Scoping will be performed by the countries that volunteer, and then the remaining countries will have to provide their position. A few people know that the joint clinical assessment will probably be related to the scientific advice process which takes place in the EMA. So the drugs that we use for clinical trials, that might also implicate the risk management plan. And it might also involve, however, it is still the subject of consultations. It's possible it will be associated with the pharmaceutical strategy. This is the subject of in-depth discussions. So joint clinical assessments can have serious implications regarding various aspects, mostly relating to pharmaceuticals and in a lesser degree to medical devices. It's important in this process to point out that if scoping is submitted, then we have scoping workshops where the stakeholder network can be invited, especially from patient organizations and healthcare providers. The list has already been announced by the EU, and then a joint clinical assessment is commissioned. The pharmaceutical company, prepares a report. If the company doesn't do it, then the coordination group does it. This will involve cooperation between various agencies, and experts are being selected. We'll also be using indirect comparisons, and it's a big challenge because depending on the population, subpopulation, the comparators will have different answers to questions. It's important to say that before the CHB opinion, we have the report published. So the final assessment from the analysis is performed, and the joint clinical assessment report is published on the website. It will be generally available, and it's important to underline that the report should be published within 30 days post-marketing approval. So if there is a positive marketing approval decision, then the joint clinical assessment report should be published within 30 days. It's an important implication regarding that. Along with the publication, an HTA report can be submitted in Poland, which means that the data needs to be developed in a very quick period of time, because the idea is to streamline joint clinical assessment processes in specific countries. It's important to say that submission of JCA will be assessed by a coordination group, which will involve subgroups. There will definitely be sometimes the need for adding the required documents. Currently, we are at the process of selecting expert. Methodology is being determined, and they are working on creating a transparent process, which will involve all countries of the EU, so it's mandatory. Jacek mentioned he's taking part in those meetings on the Polish side. So on the website you can find various templates regarding specific stages of submitting the reports and specific stages of the assessment. If we have a look at the PICO example, currently works are still being carried out regarding the reports. This is the example of 2 drugs where different PICO was selected. This is PICO selected for the purpose of the European assessments. You can see how many subpopulations we have. We have 6 different subpopulations, and we have different types of comparators. And right now, countries are discussing whether it should be the full scope or whether we should include more comparators. Why is it so important? Because PICO will be the determining factor saying whether something developed on the EU level can be implemented directly in Poland. What we are fearing is that Poland, to a certain degree, will not be participating as much, and at the level of submission to Poland, will be required to provide additional comparators. So we are facing a challenge regarding procedures, making a consistent, making us compliant with the EU regulations. The stage of creating the report, as already mentioned, we have an entity which develops the report. We also are facing discussions regarding confidential data and discussions of how the data will be presented, because one obligation will be to present all the algorithms and all the software that were used in the course of the analysis. Those algorithms will also be presented for assessment and be verified by the task forces. The report, after completion, will be submitted to the Commission for a procedural review, and the final result will be presented by the Commission. The Commission will also present any uncertainties, will point out any limited availability of evidence. So currently we are facing a big discussion between Joint Clinical Assessment and EMA, how their cooperation will look like. So there are no appraisals here. And we are facing the question to what extent analysis will be presented by the relevant entities. Currently, the scope can be limited. The question is what the actual practice will look like. When we look at issues, I will talk about the differences between what is happening in Poland and the joint clinical assessment model. PICO is supposed to be collected from the specific member states, either centrally in a central procedure or on the survey basis. Comparators will be selected in such a way so that they are as tailor-made for specific national needs as possible. So we are facing the need for horizon scanning on the European level to answer those questions. So the same real-world evidence in Poland is demanded. In Europe, it's still possible but not required. When it comes to our process is scientific and formal process which results in an appraisal. At the European level, it will be necessary to report changes that are submitted to a specific country. So if in Poland we have an updated analysis related to any data, the same analysis will have to be reported to the European level, and this update process will also be assessed on the European level. So this will be a new tool of assessing of what is happening on the national level, on the MS level. It's important to say that new documents are being created all the time. The Germans have already presented how they will incorporate the JCA into their national system. A report will be submitted to the entire process of drug availability, and the agency EQUIC will be using that result. So what appears here is the question of confidentiality of data. How confidential data will be presented to specific countries. The minimum requirements in Poland also do not discuss the issue related to confidential data and joint clinical assessment. I still have half a minute left, so I can sum up. Joint clinical assessment is a process which is very complex. We can see various issues. When I've talked to representatives of Germany or Italy, there are problems with implementation, there are problems with education. All countries need to learn how to work internationally, how to cooperate, how to report any issues, and we will be facing a discussion relating decision-making. So the majority will be deciding about what happens, also on a domestic level, on our level of Poland. So the Ministry of Health and the Agency of Health Technology Assessment in Poland are facing significant challenges. So I hope that we will be able to address some issues during our discussion. And at this point, I am moving on to the second presentation of this session, because I think that joint clinical assessment and what was said is where we will take data for the future. Will HTA be using the European Health Data Space? Well, the European Health Data Space is supposed to be a common data set from all member states, understood as scientific data and also real-world evidence. And their analysis might result in a situation where you can have access to that data, obviously in the right conditions. Which conditions, that will be discussed. I will giving the floor to Marta Musiadłowska and Jan Zygmuntowski, and they will be talking about the future of the EHDS.
Yes, I hope you can hear me. If I could just get that pilot from you. In terms of introduction, so apart from the fact that I'm living in Belgium, but I'm here now, I'm very happy to speak Polish to you because I use English on an everyday basis. Just recently, I had the opportunity to work on this regulation at the European Commission. It was part of an internship, but still I participated in the work. And now I work at the Catholic University in Leuven. It's sort of a one-stop shop for all types of data, but I focus mainly on health, on medical data, due to my past experience. And I have the unique pleasure, I think it's unique, to present this regulation to you in a nutshell. This regulation can change the healthcare sector, not just in terms of relations between patients and other stakeholders, but can also introduce a revolution in medicine, also in HTA, on many, many levels. But step by step, let me go through my slides. First, let me give you some context. The context of this draft proposal is a digital one and a health-related one. So the digital dimension. In 2020, the EU adopted a data strategy which announced the creation of joint European data spaces for energy for different industries. But the first sector was the healthcare industry, and that was the first data space created. And now the digital dimension. So the data strategy and the plan is to unleash the potential vested in data, which is an undepletable resource and can be used to many different ends. We can use knowledge from analyses of data. It can bring a lot of benefits, not just to individuals, but to the general population and also to the EU and its position in the international arena in terms of developing different types of technologies. But the health-related context is very important in terms of the difficulties we experienced in helping patients exercise their rights in terms of access and delivering data on health. This problem stemmed from different interpretations of laws in member states. But also the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic was an important and turbulent factor. It accelerated access to personal data on health and also showed us how important it is to quickly respond to health-related threats from a cross-border transnational perspective. How is this supposed to work? So it's a value-based approach and a trust-based approach, because joint data spaces are supposed to be mainly compliant. I'm using English words because it's difficult for me to translate English words to Polish, since I work with English on an everyday basis. So it's trust-based, but also based on EU laws concerning personal data, so protecting privacy, access to data, and all the data-related rights which help generate trust. And this is the basis for something I will be discussing in a moment. So on the one hand, it's related to administrative and legal aspects, but also technical ones. These are the most sensitive types of data, and we need to introduce the right safeguards. The most important points of this regulation, these points which will affect reusing such data. We can divide this whole infrastructure into primary and secondary use. Primary use is based on the patient-physician relation, and it helps provide access to electronic data to patients, to EU citizens, and to the EU, so that they can enforce and exercise their rights connected with personal data, and that they can transfer these data to different healthcare providers or social insurance institutions. And secondary use is the possibility of reusing data. It's a possibility for innovators, policymakers, data users, who can request access to a very broad range of electronic data on health, which is accumulated by data holders. And data will be guarded by health data access bodies, HDABs. What are the benefits? All the parties involved will benefit from this. Patients will receive better control over their data. Physicians, well, I'm talking about the theory, of course. Physicians will have access to more accurate and comprehensive information about their patients. Researchers and innovators, or the potential data users, will have the opportunity of improving and facilitating health technologies. The broader, the more accurate access to data, the better you can train your algorithm. And so we can create evidence-based policymaking, which we are in great need of. Now, going into the details, what is primary use about? It's nothing new, because the foundations was created by the Directive on Cross-Border Healthcare, and the My Health at EU infrastructure was created. A number of member states is already participating and will participate. It was optional until now. This was about e-prescriptions and patient summaries. And the regulation on EHTS introduces obligatory participation for all member states. As a result, more data will be fed into this health space. This will be e-prescriptions, imaging, results of laboratory tests, and patient hospital summaries. But this is not an exhaustive list. These are the priority categories. So if a member state decides they want to make more types of documents accessible in terms of primary use, they are free to do that. So what's the benefit? The benefit is regaining control aligned with GDPR, strengthening patients' rights to their data, so free access to data, limited only by ethical rules. For example, if someone is affected by a severe illness, they should not find out from an electronic system, but from a physician, and we can limit that in the system. Also, creating copies and transferring them to different providers. The right to transfer data. This right, due to low interoperability of our systems, was not really possible to enforce, but this will be strengthened by the regulation. It will also be possible to limit access to specific data for specific participants of the healthcare system. And also data from wearables or different mobile applications can be added to the health documentation of patients, and you can mark which data has been introduced by patients and which by the physicians. Moving on to secondary use, which is my favorite part of this regulation, and I think generally the most interesting and most controversial one. So the possibility of reusing health data, and this is a bit more complex in terms of infrastructure. Nothing of the sort has been in existence apart from Finland, which is running a model project for EHDS. So we have three most important participants: data users, data holders, and HDABs, health data access bodies. Anyone can be a data user, anyone who is granted access to the data. So researchers, a natural or a legal person, it can be a company, a pharma company, it can be a whole university or a university department. It can be a student who is performing some research. So anyone who files a request and is granted access can participate in reusing health data. A data holder is also covers a wide range of entities. A natural or physical person who is involved in healthcare, or an entity which is conducting scientific research, institutions, hospitals, for example, or research institutes. And every member state will be obliged to appoint a body responsible for granting access, and that will be the HDAB. Let me speed up to make time for our second speaker to this presentation, Yannick. The whole procedure in a nutshell. Let's say we have a researcher from Krakow who would like to look into throat cancer, just very generally. And he looks up an online catalogue. He can look into an EU catalogue or enter the national metadata catalogue. And he can see the descriptions of data which are available in different places. our researcher decides that the most interesting data are in Spain in Catalonian hospitals. I'm not going into details because this is just for illustrative purposes. And our researcher decides that he wants to file a request with the Spanish HTA for access to data for the purposes of his or her research. In the request, the researcher has to state the purpose of obtaining data, the description of the data, if necessary, because by default these data will be anonymized. Still, if it's very important for a specific study, the data do not have to be anonymized, but you have to provide robust grounds for that. This is very important in terms of GDPR regulations. And also, the researcher has to ensure a safe processing environment for the data. The request is filed, the Spanish HDBA examines the request and decides whether it is compliant with the regulation or maybe whether it falls within the list of prohibited purposes. So scrupulously they check step by step the whole request and then they grant an authorization or they refuse. And this is an administrative decision. And then after access is granted, our Catalonian HDBA has to contact data holders, so the several Catalonian hospitals, and request that they make the data accessible for the safe processing environment. As I worked at the EC, our IT experts explained it as follows. It's a box into which we put the data and things happen to the data. So it's an algorithm to data environment. That's where all the processing happens. And you can only derive non-personal data from the SPE. And if our user processes the data by means of their algorithm, then at the end, when we have the results, whatever they are, it is obligatory to make them publicly available. And just quickly to round up, because I can see my time is running out, what are the safeguards? Because this is so important in the trust by design approach. What safeguards are in the regulation? I think that quite a good administrative and legal safeguard is that we have the HDABs. They are appointed by member states, so they're dependent on national regulations, which not necessarily has to be good, but we have public state-level control, and they act as gatekeepers. They guard access to health data for different purposes. What are the purposes? Permitted purposes are those which are to improve public healthcare educational activity. I'm not listing all of them, I'm just giving you some examples. Training algorithms in AI-based health products, which are prohibited purposes. It is prohibited to exclude individuals or groups of people from insurance coverage or using data for producing harmful products, for example, alcohol or other narcotic substances. There are fees which are proportional to the costs of accumulating these data. So this is rather for the data holders to compensate for sharing the data. On the other hand, this fee will not be as high for SMEs or public bodies or institutions. And there are penalties for decisions incompliant with the regulation or data holders suddenly making data available without a request. And the technical safeguards, SPE secured processing environment, something I've already mentioned. Also, we will have clear cybersecurity standards set forth by the European Commission. Sorry for exceeding my time. Just let me give you the state of play. the regulation should be closed before the parliamentary elections by spring 2024. That's all we know. That's what is planned. Thank you. Thank you so much. I hope you can hear me well. Let me summarize what I have to say to keep with the time. I would like to discuss problems or challenges related to EHDS regulation. I think that this law is very important. I advocated for this. I participated in public consultations on many occasions. This is the right directions, but let's look at the details to make sure that EHDS happens. The first question is whether all the pieces of this puzzle fit together. And I've created this small diagram for you. We have this EU data strategy. That's the foundation for all the action. It sets out the values. It determines the quality of the data. It sets out the direction towards a single digital or data market. And then we have more pieces of the puzzle. We have the Data Governance Act, which is strictly related to the data strategy. It introduces a data intermediary, and this is a point of contact. Should health data be managed by such intermediaries to which we altruistically provide data, or whether this should be done by public bodies that should regulate access? Because this act is entering into force. So we have a bit of a problem here. We sense that the regulator opened too many doors but doesn't know which one he wants to pass through. Then we have the Data Act, which expands GDPR to different devices, medical devices, among others, and also extends the rights connected with personal data to the rights of any entity which is in contact with the technology. This regulation is very restrictive for the public sector, and it says that the public sector only has right of access in the case of a crisis, an extraordinary situation, while the sectoral regulation is much broader in scope. So the question is whether these pieces fit into one puzzle. I hope that the European Union will find a single uniform direction. We can adopt many different approaches, perspectives on the regulation. We performed a SWOT analysis for this. Let me look at some of the weaknesses, some of the threats, which are of course combined with opportunities. The most important strength is that the HTA is a single point, a one-stop shop for access. As a result, the rules we adopt for HDABs can minimize data leaks or illegal provision of access to data, which is not necessarily favorable for other stakeholders. This is connected with a weakness because the regulation does not clearly define how HDABs should be governed. So we have an access body, but we don't know who sets the rules, how these requests are evaluated, and what are the rules for granting data permits is not known. This opens the door to cooperating with different stakeholders, but also a certain risk, because we don't have set procedures for HDABs at the EU level and also in Poland. Let me use a model that I developed. It was published in a paper a couple of months ago, and it shows that we have a trilemma to resolve. We want to serve the public interest. We want to develop the healthcare system. On the other hand, we need to protect fundamental rights, the right to privacy, to non-discrimination, and others. Still, we want to increase access. because this helps us generate economic value.
Wyjściem z tego trylematu jest zauważenie
We can resolve this trilemma by taking note of two data-related phenomena. Firstly,
generalnie można ich używać w różnych procesach.
data can be used for different processes, HTA among others, but they are very relational, not just towards an individual person, but also groups of people.
Dotyczy ta sama choroba.
So groups of patients with the same disease.
Są naturalnie sklejeni tą
Such groups are naturally bound into one category. And we can see that in groups of patients who self-organize online to make their data accessible for research and scientific purposes. But also the structure of data shows that they should be classed as infrastructure. That's the second point. So to resolve this trilemma, we need to acknowledge collective data rights and use that as a basis for setting the rules. Let me speed up a bit and move on to a prototype, a model HDAB, and that's FIN data. Let me point to one important thing. These decisions on access to data are made on a discretionary basis by the director of FIN data. However, some of the rules are set forth in a regulation which forms part of the Finnish law, but they do not involve stakeholders to a broad extent. It is possible to introduce different governance. NHS, for example, introduced a different solution. They are now testing different governance methods, mainly expert committees which bring together different stakeholders and evaluate the requests for data access. They are also testing patient juries. So a jury made up of patients which provide a bottom-up perspective. Retrospective evaluation and case-by-case evaluation are two other methods tested now by the NHS. To round off, I think we can make the EHDS better. We have to recognize that the HDABs are key here. Eurobarometer shows us that we have highest trusts in EU institutions. It's higher than trust in national governments and institutions. Therefore, we think the EU should set forth the rules for HDABs involving stakeholders and joint governance. And also, it's important to set the relations between bottom-up data intermediaries and top-down HDABs, and we should bring them together. We should have bottom-up patient participation and experts involved in the decision-making process, and we have to acknowledge this is a public structure and requires public financing. The rules are very important. We should make sure they are enforced. Large companies, pharma or tech companies, focus mainly on intellectual property rights and protecting those rights, while our data infrastructure shows that we need to move in the direction of openness, of continuous data use. So maybe we shouldn't make everything fully open on a public license, but we should adopt something in between to protect the public interest. Thank you so much for your attention. Thank you very much for your presentation. That was EHDS in a nutshell, but still we can devote a whole session to that issue and discuss different related aspects, legal, technological, quality of data. So what is the direction of HTA development? The perspective of the pharma industry is key here. You can see that the cooperation of different bodies, building trust, providing access to data, those issues will affect everyone in the European Union in a moment. And the key question is, what will our development look like? I hand over to Michał Byliniak from Infarma Poland.
Dziękuję za zaproszenie. Magda dzisiaj
First of all, thank you for the invitation. Magda has already said a lot about joint clinical assessment. I will add another layer to it and add some national context, which will be presented from the point of view of pharmaceutical companies, so the applicants who will be playing a significant role in this process. When it comes to the concept itself, Magda already said it, and I will reiterate, this is not a new concept. It's not something that is just a result of a few people's idea. It is a project which is the mirror reflection of the functioning of the EU in general, so a form of centralized decision-making and taking away repetitive actions from the member states. So it's not a new concept. So we have had a central marketing authorization system for years. It's not the same, but it is comparable. So we also have decentralized marketing authorizations where member states are relieved of certain obligations. The same applies to joint clinical assessment, the subject of many years of discussion, different ways of the different ideas, and in the end we have managed to develop a joint regulation. We are waiting for the final entrance into force. Now we have a transitional period. All you know who have had the chance to observe implementations in the pharmaceutical area and other sectors as well, everyone knows that it's not an easy process, and this process has been made even more difficult by the fact that this requires the collaboration of ministries, agencies at a level which has not been in place before. So if we were to analyze the decision making, we'd probably find various analogies. However, now we are going through this process anew. And in this project, we have something that is important and which was seen at the level of creating this regulation. So the difference between decisions taken on a central level and on the national level. Magda mentioned the possibility of agencies applying for additional evidence. We talked about PICO, and it's an important groundwork for what we think about it as the pharmaceutical industry. To what extent a decision made on a central level will be implemented on the national level without unnecessary prolongings. The idea was to take away the repetitive elements and to speed up the process. Of course, the innovative pharmaceutical company sector seems to be the most important stakeholder from the applicant part. We support this. For us, streamlining access, the process of providing patients with new drugs is most important to us. So for us, this regulation is an opportunity, obviously with certain conditions met. When it comes to huge expectations, well, facilitation and speeding up of the process. For global companies, it is something that definitely streamlines the internal process. It allows us to think not in 27 different regulations, but on one regulation. And we also have this condition that we need to have this process as uniform as possible. what are the expectations from the point of view of companies? Well, they want clear, workable, predictable frameworks. We are talking about 2025. Right now it's 2023. It might seem like a distant perspective, but it is not, because if the dossiers are to submitted in January 2025, the groundwork for that should already be prepared. So it's important from the EU perspective is that we all know what elements should be included in that dossier. We are still talking about what PICO schemes should be included and what this process will involve. So a clear framework, that's the expectation. And the second expectation is that it is an actual streamlining factor, that the red tape is reduced, that if we submit a correctly submitted application, a correctly submitted report, so that we have the guarantee that it will go through all stages of the assessment without any hiccups. And time. Yes, time is of essence. 2025 is as soon. It's almost December, then it's the new year. So if we have a look at the calendar, we can see that the applicants have even less time to prepare. So the question of access to results of analysis to speed up national processes. It's particularly important for Poland because without being set well in the EU, we won't be the first country to be where the submissions are made. So access to results from other member states and results of the joint clinical assessment report will be very important for Poland to speed up access. How can that be achieved? We've talked about PICO being determined. Horizon scanning is extremely important. It is very important. So inclusion is very important. So the applicant should be included in the decision-making process, so that the creator of the health technology should be involved in the process, so that the creator of the technology can provide as good data as possible, so that the agency is provided with the best evidence. We also heard already about the changing process of determining PICO. So the question is whether the PICO schemes will be very broad or will they be narrowed down, so that on the national level they will be added by additional elements. Well, it's a huge question of which model is better. The initially chosen path was not the best one, and there are certain challenges. Obviously, it's difficult to point fingers at what is to blame, but even we already now have discrepancies between countries. Some countries are very involved in the process. Other countries are as involved, as uninvolved as possible. So you can see different approaches. So at the beginning of the process, with the first JCAs, we might be experiencing significant challenges. From the perspective of the pharmaceutical sector, we should not, the appraisals should not be disqualified. So this is a discrepancy with the current expectations. We should also find a discrepancy, a differentiation between the EU JCA process and the EU MA process. So these processes are not that much intertwined. We are aware that agencies have different resources. They have different processes in place. And we have significant doubts as to whether the current available resources in national agencies across Europe they will probably require internal changes to allow for streamlined performance of the process, especially at this initial period. When it comes to pharmacy, we are living in very interesting times. We are experiencing a lot of change, and past experiences show that such changes implement a lot of change, practical change for the companies. Regulators know how to act, but here we are afraid that changing this well-proven system can result in extending the time needed for decisions to be made on the national level. So our concern is that the resources should be sufficient and the existing processes should be adjusted to allow for a streamlined process across Europe. From our perspective, the whole of Europe is a set of intertwined bodies. So we should have a helicopter view on the entire European market, see what principles apply. And I would say that JCA is the key element of making the drug available to the patient. The process is a lengthy one, but the key aspect is understanding that in the context of the upcoming changes in providing exclusivity, we should be aware that all regulations will be brought together at one point. We have to keep in mind that our national regulations, like our Polish Act on Reimbursement, it will have a significant aspect on the new impact on the new process because it will impose time limitations for application examination. So it is possible we will be facing an extending of the process, application process, for reasons that are not dependent on the company. On this slide, you can see a graph which you've already seen. You can see a Polish flag there on the graph. This shows that the applications submitted in Poland, they will most likely be submitted after the results of the JCA have been published, after the product has already been introduced in other countries. So locally, it's important how and to what extent we will be able to use conclusions from other countries and to what extent we will be able to avoid additional submissions with new data. This will be particularly important for countries such as Poland. It will be important from the perspective of establishing the rules for the process. What are the challenges? It's timely introduction of legal solutions and organizational solutions. In theory, we have the framework, but we know the time framework, but very often we do things at the very last moment in Poland. We know that the period around the elections does not help in processing various aspects. We hope that this point will return to the priority agenda, and I hope that the Polish regulations will be changed in a timely manner. So we are facing the risk of prolonging the process of analyzing reimbursement proceedings, especially given the gateway in the provisions, which allows for a local application to submit additional documents, additional data. So it might turn out that JCA is one thing, but we need to have it our way. So the practical implications might be different. We also need to there is a need for structure and clarifying of the scope of comparators in the PICO. That's something I already mentioned. We also need to have methodological guidelines developed which take JCA into account. And we need to have the principles of updating JCA analysis determined. It will be the question of a debate on whether we should have a central procedure or a local procedure, which one is more important, and in which model we should focus on. This will not be easy. When it comes to what is the key for success, cooperation is always the key. Probably if representatives of our authorities, of our bodies were active, this would provide a lot of support at the EU level and at the level of dialogue with applicants, with the pharmaceutical companies. So we need cooperation interactions at the early stage of consultations. We need to increase the significance of scientific consultations with regard to PICO. We need the amendment of legal acts, all in the spirit of a social dialogue. We declare that we want to support dialogue. We try to do it with other acts of law, and I hope that also in this case we will be able to provide our support during the consultations leading to the amendment of the Polish regulations. And we need an update of HTA guidelines, which would also be performed in cooperation with stakeholders. So the key thing is a successful launching of the and implementation of the regulation, which would lead to the shortening of the period for processing the applications. Everyone should do their best to make sure that without any detriment to the quality, without the detriment to the sense of reliability of the applications, the process is shortened and leading to a situation where the patient receives the drug as soon as possible. I'm giving the floor to Magda.
Thank you so much for giving your perspective to us. It was interesting to see what was key for cooperation between different entities. Our session is very rich in presentations, but I hope we will still have time for discussions. Let me hand over to Karen Facey, Scottish HTA Agency, one of the leading representatives of HTA in Scotland, in the UK, but also an international activist, very active in RWE.
That you couldn't come, but I hope so your presentation about the cooperation regarding the label RWE data regarding the precision and decision making is crucial for our discussion. Also, how to thinking about developing data in systems, but also on European level. That's why the floor is yours. We don't hear you. Still, we don't hear you. Could you a little louder because it's very. We have some technical problems. We could wait. We don't hear you.
Sorry.
Oh,
Is that better?
Yeah, it's okay.
I apologize. That's great. And hopefully the technical team can put my slides up. That's great. I'm very sorry I can't be with you, Magda. It would have been a pleasure to be part of this wonderful conference, but thank you for including me virtually. I am going to think in terms of HTA development internationally and integrating evidence in terms of the potential of real-world data. And as you indicated there, I'm sitting in Scotland at the moment. I'm a statistician by training. I came here 23 years ago and was incredibly excited to come to Scotland because we are lucky to have a unique patient identifier, which we've had since the 1960s. So we've got wonderful data resources that we can use to understand patient care. We have a history of having national audits of a range of aspects of our care. We've got good disease registries for things like diabetes and heart care. And you can see here the different range of data that is now emerging from biobanks, etc. But it's data is always more challenging to use than one imagines. So it's only about 10 years ago that our primary care prescriptions, you can see here in the picture, actually started including the unique patient identifier on them so that we could identify which patient was getting which prescription. But of course, prescriptions aren't the only answer. We need to know the diagnosis for which the medicine is given. So it's really important that we develop our data systems to be able to answer the questions that we as decision makers have. And I'm talking about the situation in primary care where we have good prescribing data, and that prescribing data is now going into the European health data space. But we still struggle even in hospitals. In hospitals, our data is not digitized in the same way in which it is in primary care. So even though we have a very good system, we still have quite a long way to go in terms of making data usable. And as decision makers in health technology assessment, we're not the only one that see the value of real world data. Here is a presentation which I love, which was given by colleagues in the European Medicines Agency back in 2016, where they were reflecting on the value of real world data. And of course, regulators have always used real world data for pharmacovigilance purposes to understand the long-term safety of a product. And you can see here that 8 years ago or so now, the regulators were saying, we see real world data not just being used for pharmacovigilance purposes, but also for informing us about natural history, about utilization of drug, as well as drug safety. And for this, a range of data might be appropriate. So prospective cohort studies, health insurance data, electronic health records, biobanks, surveys, etc. And we've heard the development of the European health data space. And we know that what the regulators have been doing in the European Medicines Agency is sort of piloting how they might use that data. They've had a number of reports on the potential of big data, and they've taken that forward to enact Darwin EU. So that's the Data Analysis and Real World Interrogation Network. And we in the HTA community have been engaging with EMA because we see this as a very exciting development. So Darwin EU is taking data from across Europe, including, I have to say, the UK. They're letting us in using our data, even though we're not part of the union anymore. And what they are creating is a federated network, as similar to the whole of the European health data space, whereby the data stays where it is and you interrogate the data with certain questions. So there's a common data model being used and a common protocol with rapid analytics software there. And the exciting thing is that they are reaching out to HTA and payers and asking them about the kind of questions that they may ask, because really this system has been set up for their own advantages, but it has real potential for HTA, even in terms of things like characterizing a disease. That's actually incredibly difficult for many of the rare diseases we see. And one of the big questions we have as payers is, how many patients do we actually in our country or in our health jurisdiction that have this particular kind of condition or have failed X number of lines of therapies? Can we characterize? And actually, even if we could get that kind of information, it would be incredibly informative to us. I'm just aware that the connection has been lost, so was lost there. I think we're back again. Apologies for that. Let's move on to the next slide. My clicker doesn't seem to be working, so I think I'm back again now. My slide connection seems to have been lost, so I will continue without my slides until the technical team can bring that back. So I was talking there about Darwin EU from the European Medicines Agency, and that's a really exciting development which HTA and payers can use as well. So moving on, what we see is that the regulators, not just in Europe, but in the US and Japan and around the world, are seeing the potential of real-world data. But they're recognizing that there are a range of guidances that are available from their own systems, and they're trying to harmonize those. And that will be interesting work to see. And the CIOMS group, which is mainly regulatory, have published a really great guidance, and I really recommend anybody interested in real-world data, which is real-world data and real-world evidence in regulatory decision-making. But as part of that document, they recognize that this guidance has potential for HTA and payers. And so let's get on to, I mentioned that we use real-world data in HTA to characterize our population. If we do economic modeling like you do in Poland, it's also important for us to understand the care pathway and set up the comparator pathway to understand the natural history and long-term effects. So we've always used real-world data in our economic modeling, and that's very important. But what we're seeing now is more use of real-world data to create external control arms, because with highly innovative, high-cost treatments, what we're seeing is very early access to the market, often with single-arm, short-duration trials. And that is proving to be a real problem for us as payers, as we have to understand the value of that product and predict what the long-term benefits are going to be and the competitive benefits. So we are seeing more discussion about whether real-world data can generate robust real-world evidence that can inform our discussions about the added benefits of technologies. And so we have got together a group which we call Real World Evidence for Decisions. This group has been running for about 7 years now, led by the CEO of the payer, Yoda Koch at INAMI. And he really wanted to explore whether real world data could help in the difficult decisions he was seeing as a payer about these highly innovative, high cost technologies, because he'd sort of heard about the promise of real world data, but also heard about the challenges of whether it could deliver robust real world evidence for decision making. And we've been talking about the potential of real world evidence in two different ways. So firstly, can a health technology developer think about how they should be generating real world evidence during their usual clinical development plan so that it's filling the gaps, resolving the uncertainties that we as HTA and payers are seeing? And if we get to the point where we have to make a decision for pricing and reimbursement, but there are still uncertainties, is it possible to set up post-launch real-world evidence generation that can deliver evidence that helps us at a later stage, maybe 3 or 5 years later, to inform our decision making and a reassessment and a pricing and reimbursement renegotiation. And indeed, can we use real world data for value-based agreements? So, for example, can we use it to pay for performance? All of these are the kind of questions this network has been discussing for the past 7 years or so. And we're lucky that the network is led by a multi-stakeholder steering group, including HTA, payers, patients, clinicians, and we are funded by a range of pharmaceutical companies. And the aim of the network is we have open dialogues about the potential of real-world data, but all of the challenges as well. Because it's not just HTA and payers that see challenges in assessing real-world evidence, but by dialogue, we hear how challenging it is for sponsor companies to actually set up these studies and ensure that they provide fit-for-purpose data for HTA and payers. And so as a result of that dialogue, we've done a systematic review to understand the payers' concerns about real-world data. And what we've identified is that there are 4 key elements that we think are necessary to build robust real-world evidence to inform pricing and reimbursement decisions. And the key to that is the red pillar, data quality. When we talk to most HTA bodies, they have real concerns about the use of real-world data because of the quality of the data and the quality of the real-world evidence that's presented to them. There are methodological issues, but we're seeing advances in methods all the time. So, for example, things like quantitative bias analyses, which are being used to help resolve issues around confounders and lack of confounders. These new methods are all coming through and are all very interesting. We also need trust. And that means trust, particularly between developers and HTA bodies, around what is possible, and to ensure that what developers aren't doing is, in a sense, cherry picking the best results to present to us. Because when we have an RCT, we know that many of the biases we're concerned about are taken care of by randomization. So we have to do a lot more to show the trust in a real-world evidence cohort study. And for that, we need transparency. So we need to understand how a real-world evidence study has been planned, what the statistical analysis was before the data were curated. So we need as much rigor with a real-world evidence study as we do with a standard clinical study. And I think to do this, we need policy and partnerships. There are lots of projects going on that are looking at use of real-world data, and we need to encourage those. And thinking about those 4 pillars, we thought, is there any guidance around? I've shown you some of the regulatory guidance, but when we looked at the 4 pillars, what we recognized was that there are a range of organizations who have presented guidance from organizations like pharmacoepidemiology, like NCEP organizations, and indeed our own HTA bodies are increasingly looking at how they will assess real-world data. And I think it comes down to 2 main elements if we look at that key concept of quality. And this comes from the FDA report, which is that we're all looking for fit-for-purpose data. And if I apologize again that the connection was lost. If we look at the FDA, we can see that there are 2 main concepts to consider. So firstly, we need to consider whether a particular data set is reliable. So where has it come from? Is it measuring outcomes accurately? Do we know the traceability of the data? And are the data complete? And so that's the way in which we judge the quality of a particular data set or registry. Then we need to ask, is it relevant for our study question? And in thinking about that, we need to think about the completeness and the confounders in relation to our own research question. And these kind of concepts have been picked up by guidance in a range of recent publications from HTA bodies. You can see on the top left guidance from the AHRQ, and they've been producing guidance about how to develop registries and analyze data from registries for many years now. They're on their 4th edition, and it's a really wonderful document if you want to look at how to set up and analyze from a registry. People like IQWiG, who are traditionally, the Germans are seen as being somewhat reticent about use of real-world data, are starting to produce guidance about how real-world data could be used from their own administrative systems. Then we've got HAS down in France, we've got NICE in England, and most recently, the Canadians have produced a very detailed guide about how to report a real-world evidence study. And these are all important documents, not only for health technology developers, but I think for other HTA bodies like our own in Scotland and like yours in Poland. We can all learn from what others are doing. And what we can also see is the excellent output from the European Network for HTA, Joint Action 3. Although that's now completed, this tool is actually very valuable. It was the tool called Request, which was to evaluate the quality of disease registries. And this helps us to check that kind of provenance and quality issue, and is increasingly being used by registry holders themselves. So we know that the European Blood and Marrow Transplant Registry, for example, has used this tool. And we've heard recently that Canadian disease registries are using this. So that's something we can do, is if we want to use disease registries for real-world data, apply this tool and see how well the registry meets up to the standards, and perhaps use that as an indication to develop the registry. In the NICE guidance, what we see is really helpful case studies about how real-world data has been used, which identifies the different ways in which real-world data might be used for characterization of disease, for resource use and costs, for long-term effectiveness. And it shows how different data from our own prescribing systems, and you can see there for extrapolation, the Flatiron Health data set was used, which of course is US data. So we as HTA bodies are also addressing these questions about the transferability and transportability of data from one system to a next, and the questions we need to ask about real-world data sources and whether we can use them in our own healthcare systems. The other developments we're seeing, really exciting developments, I think, in Spain. We have the Valtamed system, which has been set up for about 3 years now, and this is producing really interesting results. So here in a pricing and reimbursement negotiation, there is a requirement within the final reimbursement deal that additional data collection must be collected within this new national system. A protocol is created for the additional data collection in collaboration with the ministry and the health technology developers. And the protocol clearly shows the data that will be collected and how outcomes will be measured. And that then requires all regions within Spain to enter the data required before they can prescribe the medicine, so that the data collection is guaranteed. And interim reports are now being published on the Valtamed website, so we can not only see as countries what other countries are doing in terms of additional data collection, but we can see their emerging results. And again, that could be very important for us as smaller countries, as countries with less advanced data collection systems, to start to be able to use the real-world evidence emerging from other countries. So I think that my key message here is that in the past, as HTA bodies, we've had some concerns about real-world data quality, but I think we are all talking together about how we improve the quality of real-world data and the real-world evidence we develop from that. But that actually that requires iterative dialogues, and this shouldn't just be happening at the point of the joint clinical assessment, which we've heard about earlier. What we really want is that earlier on, in joint scientific consultations in the EU process, the company starts talking about their real world evidence generation plans, and perhaps that there may need to be longer term real world data collection post launch. So this is a life cycle approach to real world evidence generation. And by having that kind of approach, we can really optimize treatment and improve outcomes. And I apologize for the connection issues there, but hope that that presentation came over more or less clearly. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen, for very interesting real-world data evidence generation, which is, I think, the future. Also, to maybe build a European health data space. Even not UK is not in this no more in this cooperation, but of course it will be changing all the time. I hope so that your cooperation with different bodies, especially so wide way stakeholders, is crucial to really build the understanding of especially the accuracy of data, and also understanding the transparency of the process, especially that we discussed here, the rights of the patients, and also generally how to build the more reliable systems. Thank you, Karen, for staying with us. Maybe it will be time for discussion. Now I would like to invite Clifford Goodman, who is with us, but also online from United States, and even that is so early. And Clifford was coming a few times to Poland. Thank you, Clifford, again. And I hope so that you introduce us to integration of data and evidence for HTA and where we are going. I hope so that you give us some answers where we are going and what is our future.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here. We'll put up the slides, if you will, and then I can advance them. All right, I'm going to address integrating data into evidence for HTA. Where is our future? And I'll try to kind of go through this promptly for the sake of time. I think people here know the relationship between real-world data and real-world evidence. Real-world data are compiled, analyzed, and interpreted into building real-world evidence. If you want a formal definition of the two, you can see it there. With regard to real-world evidence, we know that it's derived from data sources other than traditional RCTs. I think you've heard from previous speakers some of its characteristics that you see there. I want to emphasize the fourth one, that it rebalances. It rebalances the relative importance of real-world evidence versus traditional pre-marketing clinical trials for regulatory approval. In years and decades past, we had to rely almost entirely on the pre-marketing clinical trials. Now, with the presence of real-world evidence, it has a larger role in understanding safety, effectiveness, and so forth. By the way, this rebalancing is especially important these days when the regulatory hurdles are often lower and there are accelerated pathways to market. That means that HTA bodies, payers, and others have to rely more on real-world evidence. With regard to complementing but not yet substituting for traditional RCTs, researchers are looking at ways to perhaps replicate RCTs in some ways, but not necessarily replace them. That's a bit of controversy, and I certainly want to follow that. Big data, I'm talking about very, very large data sets for real-world evidence, and you've heard about these sort of cooperative European ventures in that area. I know that in the US, some of the large payers have hundreds of millions of lives covered in current years and in past years, with billions of data points, and those are being derived from claims data and electronic health records. These are massive, massive data sets, and the analytical tools and high throughput computer programming and power are really accelerating our use of real-world evidence. This is a very important set of accomplishments. I think you've heard from Karen and others about the many, many sources of real world data. I want to emphasize that the sources are expanding. We are originally thought of real world data as registries and claims and electronic health records. Certainly, electronic health records are becoming larger and more expansive. But even down toward the bottom, you see environmental data from housing and food and transportation and occupational, environmental, and so forth. And then data from real world data from social media. We are not only enlarging our current sets of real world data, we're expanding their sources. Now, this is an important point that I'm going to come back to later, but when you think about real world data, there are different dimensions along which to consider it, but one important dimension is the extent to which it is structured. Structured real world data are diagnosis codes, procedure codes, demographic information, information that is carefully categorized and easy to discern. Semi-structured, certain kinds of laboratory results or radiology reports where you have hard data, but then you've got bits of narrative and so forth. It's not as formally structured. And then entirely unstructured data or free text, such as would be the notes that a physician makes in an electronic health record or clinical notes. Certainly among the major challenges of increasing the potential of real-world evidence is extracting data from not only structured sources, but semi-structured and unstructured. And I'm going to come back to that important distinction later. There are many applications of real-world evidence. I'm not going to go through them here because previous speakers have discussed them. I will only say that the applications are becoming broader and deeper and more sophisticated as our resources expand. An important point is not only the types of real-world data and evidence sources, it's our ability to link them. Yes, you can learn a lot from claims data. Yes, you can learn a lot from clinical data and other sources, but when you start linking them, the analytic power goes up exponentially. So I can tell you not only did you have a certain service from claims data, I can tell you if I know what your laboratory results and combine those with the services over a period of time, I learn much, much more. So it's not just the number of sources or the size of each individual source, it's the ability to link them. There are many real-world evidence applications in health technology assessment. Karen and others have talked about them. These are, I think, the main ones, but there are certainly other applications such as these or more detailed applications such as these. I particularly like to look at validating surrogate endpoints to show correlation between a proposed surrogate endpoint and a true health outcome. That's very, very important. And it's because I think a lot of the work in oncology and certain other fields is increasingly dependent on trying to validate biomarkers to see whether they are true surrogate endpoints. Very important in oncology and certain other fields. Now, I think we know what the strengths of real-world evidence are, and here are a whole bunch of real-world evidence strengths. I'm not going to go over them, but these are the reasons why we like to rely on real-world evidence where we can. And then there's a long list of weaknesses and challenges to real-world evidence. Why am I showing you this very long list? The reason I'm showing you this very long list of weaknesses and challenges is to point out, as we say, the glass is not half empty, it's half full. Most of these weaknesses and challenges have the potential to be partially or fully overcome as we develop our analytical tools and move into areas such as artificial intelligence. As we get larger data sets and we can link them, and we get into not just hundreds or thousands of patients as you would in a clinical trial, but millions and tens of millions of patients and crossing their data with electronic health records and other sources, you start to overcome some of these challenges. You start to make adjustments, statistical adjustments to try to account for some of these challenges. So I look at all these challenges as having future potential for being overcome. Now, the future of real-world evidence in health technology assessment does depend on a set of analytical tools and other approaches for overcoming those very same weaknesses that I just showed you. And I do want to emphasize the use of artificial intelligence. AI, artificial intelligence, does have certain roles in overcoming some of the weaknesses and challenges in real-world evidence. Now, AI is a very big topic. There are various sorts of methods and applications that you see here. The area that is most interesting to me is machine learning and then deep learning. Deep learning is multi-layered machine learning, and it sort of mimics or replicates how our brains work insofar as the many synapses and neural networks. That's a very, very promising area. But as you can see, there's a lot to go on here, a lot of development here in AI that you could start thinking about. How does this overcome some of our challenges in real world evidence? And as you can see, there's some overlaps here with regard to machine learning, deep learning, and so forth. I think when you get into the field of AI, a lot of it has to do with understanding some of the terminology and the relative relationships between, let's say, AI, machine learning, deep learning, neural networks, GPT, and so forth. So part of utilizing AI applications is just sort of understanding the evolving vocabulary. Now, one of the really important aspects is natural language processing as a form of AI. And remember how I talked about differently structured data. So natural language processing, NLP, is a particular application of artificial intelligence. It relies on deep learning, as it turns out, and it enables searching and filtering through millions of unstructured plain language text. Remember I talked about structured, semi-structured, and unstructured? With natural language processing, we now have an increasingly powerful tool to dive in to unstructured notes and other things that are not the most structured data sources. That opens up an opportunity to utilize data that were otherwise very difficult to use. Anyone who's had to go into medical charts to try to extract information from them knows how long it takes and how expensive it is. NLP, as an application of AI, can pull this off. And other examples of NLP applications are document analysis, doing online searches, predictive text. You start to hear things like GPT and ChatGPT and so forth. Language translation, as I said, chat box, email filtering, social media monitoring. There are a lot of applications of NLP that can utilize more and overcome certain challenges and weaknesses of real-world evidence. Now, I'm pointing this out to people when we think about, well, is AI there yet? Can we really use it in these fantastic ways? If you look at the recent history of the use of AI in language recognition, speech recognition, image recognition, reading comprehension, language understanding, you can see that since about 2000 or a little bit before the late 1990s, how quickly these applications of AI have achieved virtually equality with human performance, which is the line towards the top with the zero there. You can see that. So especially lately with reading comprehension and language understanding, these things are happening very quickly. A generation ago, people thought AI would prove itself if it could play chess. Well, it can beat the grandmasters in chess now. It has done it many years ago at this point. It is doing the things that we didn't know it could do, but much more quickly than we anticipated. So there are many applications of AI in healthcare. You see them there: diagnosis, therapy, public health, administrative ways, prediction, forecasting, and so forth. I won't go into those in detail, but AI has many applications in healthcare that use real-world data or real-world evidence. All these applications here draw in some way or can draw in some way on real-world data. Now, when you think about some interesting examples about how artificial intelligence in healthcare draws on these, there are some wonderful examples here in various conditions. It can be used to identify patients with undiagnosed or underdiagnosed diseases. It's good for predictive and prescriptive analytics. It has a long history in breast cancer detection using deep learning mammography. Skin cancer diagnosis has actually been around for quite some time, detecting heart arrhythmias and so forth. There are a variety of applications that you will see when you hear about what's AI doing in healthcare. Many of those draw on certain sources of real world data. And in particular, I know a lot of people here are interested in pharmaceuticals and biologics. There are a variety of applications of AI using RWD in drugs. One of my favorite is the one all the way at the bottom, in silico drug design, where we apply machine learning to screen simulated molecular docking. In other words, the interacting receptor and a potential drug. And we can do that in silico, that is on computers. And you can run through millions of potential molecules using that. And there is a role for real world data in helping to build those. Other applications, and you can see there's a lot of literature on applying AI to drug development using real world data. The US Food and Drug Administration is quite aware of how this is done and using machine learning and deep learning to actually develop drugs in the kinds of ways I mentioned and others. I won't go into detail about that now, but there's quite a deepening literature on that. Also, there's artificial intelligence in medical devices, and this gets really interesting when you think about artificial intelligence in like heart monitors or continuous glucose monitors and so forth, and insulin delivery devices. You see that the greatest potential of the machine learning resides in its ability to create new and important insights into the vast amounts of data generated during the delivery of healthcare every day. So the regulatory agencies like FDA, EMA, and others are having to kind of adjust how they think about and regulate, let's say, medical devices that use machine learning and artificial intelligence, and has come up with some guidance about how to do that. I'll tell you what's really interesting about this. Think for a moment, and this is what this slide is about. Think for a moment about an implantable device that not only uses data to predict events, but it continues to learn. It continues to learn from that person, herself or himself, or from getting data remotely from a central source that continue to make it a better predictive modeling device. So it uses AI, it uses machine learning to get better and better. Well, at some point, its ability to perform its functions using machine learning, ongoing machine learning, at some point you've got to say, well, now it's a new device. It's working differently now than when we first approved it or we first used it. So the regulators are trying to understand at what point do you have to say, well, wait a minute, what you really have now is a new device. The hardware may be the same, but the software has changed because it's continually learning through machine learning. To me, that's a very fascinating development. Now, furthermore, for all those of us in the field of HTA, think about using artificial intelligence to run systematic reviews. We've all participated in systematic literature reviews, and there has been some computer programming around for some years to do this. But now with AI, it's much more comprehensive. And you can run systematic reviews in ways that start to really closely mimic how we humans do systematic literature reviews. And there's a potential for a lot of time to be saved and efficiencies. I still think you need somebody to a team to go back and check what happened here. But this is something that could affect how we actually do HTA, because most HTAs of which I know have in some point a literature review. As a matter of fact, a systematic literature review. And you can see there's some other ways to go find that and how this is being done. It still has some weaknesses and challenges, but we're on our way to having that is what I think may be a routine tool. Now, I've told you a lot of upsides here about the use of real world data, real world evidence. There are a lot of ways to get this wrong, a lot of ways to make mistakes here. And there are potential for unintended consequences. If you're in the field of HTA, you know that HTA is not only about intended consequences, but unintended consequences here. And you can see a list of these. I think some of the most important ones are if the data that are used are biased in some way, and we know that they can be. If AI, or let's say machine learning, is based on a large data set that has inherent biases, then what the machine learning learns is going to be biased, and its output can be biased. So if we do this wrong, we can propagate wrong, bad data and bad findings. So there are a lot of mistakes that can be made there. We've got to be very careful. There are also risks to patient safety, perhaps. There's risk to clinician autonomy. There's something called AI hallucinations, which is when basically AI kind of makes up its own findings. And I'll just go back to that for a moment. AI hallucinations, they may come from things like you've heard of ChatGPT, the generative pre-trained transformer language models. They look like they're giving you something that sounds right, but it can be entirely made up. There have been some important cases where in law, for example, we're using large language models, generative large language models, create references or cite previous law that never existed. It just made up a new bibliography, as it were. So the point there is that there's a lot of upsides to AI, including its applications of real-world evidence, but we always have to be careful of the downsides and the potential risks that I listed out in detail here. So I know that I've gone through that very, very quickly in the interest of time. I'll stop there. And by the way, my slides are available to anyone who might request them through the organizers. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much for very interesting speech. I think that together with Karen, you presented what's going in Europe, but also internationally. And I hope so that we have the first session, and it was discussion if AI can replace the HTA people. Not so fast. What we see in this moment, not so fast. Even that we develop very fast in your slide is very interesting how to see that is changing quite quickly, and I think that now even logarithmic speed will be growing because it's already, the curve is changing very fast. Okay, any questions from the room? Maybe because we have still 3 minutes, maybe from anybody from the speakers? Anybody's interested to? If not, I have...
Copy of Karen's slides, I'll tell you that.
Okay, I have one question to Karen and Clifford, maybe in the fast way, because here we have speakers in Poland, and we can still discuss during the lunch. Do you think that it's already that is a recognition across the maybe high-income countries that should be some kind of harmonization? Karen mentioned that it's happened on real-world data, but do you think it happened in the same way as a clinical trials? And that's why artificial intelligence even could develop faster? Do you think it's possible to build next 2, 5? How long?
I think that's a great question, Magda. And I think part of the challenge is that real-world data is being used for different purposes. Yeah. So I think the payers are often asking the question, how is the new medicine working in my healthcare system? And so that means there's always going to be an element of wanting to collect the data in your own healthcare system. But I think we're also recognizing that some healthcare systems are quite like other healthcare systems. So, for example, in Scotland, we often don't see enough patients with the rare conditions to be able to generate good evidence, but actually we could be combining that even across the border with England, but we find that we don't have the processes for that. We don't even have the processes to discuss transportability, but we are now seeing that. I think the fact that we've had some successful use of Flatiron data, so US data in England, is really interesting. And I think we need to stop being so colloquial and saying data must come from our own systems and actually be clear about how we assess data and its appropriateness for our system. So it's a long-worded answer. I think there's still a lot of reticence to real-world data because of the quality issues. So I think it's not going to be the exponential growth like we've seen with AI. I think it's going to be gradual working together to build that trust.
How you, Cliff?
I would add, this is Cliff, I'd add as well that as numbers increase, some of the problems with bias can be reduced through certain kinds of statistical adjustments. I heartily agree that a patient wants to hear the answer to the question, how does this treatment work for patients like me, in my age group, with my risk factors, with my comorbidities? And the larger these numbers get, and in some of, I know the US large commercial insurers in the Medicare program, you really do get into tens of millions of people. And sometimes if you look longitudinally, hundreds of millions of people. And if you can link the claims data and the EHR data, you can start finding cohorts of patients that look like me. And so with the powerful analytics. Now, Karen brings up rightfully that in these rare conditions, the sample sizes are always small. That's why these large networks can be especially helpful. For rare diseases, if you can pull together the small ends from multiple countries, then you start to get into numbers that are worthwhile. But that, I think, is a big thing to achieve.
Thank you very much. It was really interesting. I hope so that we see soon, maybe in Sevilla next year, if not, maybe earlier. I will be in touch with you. I really would like to maybe discuss more regarding real-world data evidence because it's also a hot topic in Poland, especially that also we are working on our standardization of data collection, especially for drugs. That's why it's also interesting how we see maybe soon in Poland, maybe not machine learning yet, but probably in the future also we will going deep. Thank you very much for all of you. I invite you in 1 hour for next session. Thank you. For everybody for joining, especially Clifford very early in United States, and we'll be in touch. Thank you. Dziękuję Państwu za uwagę.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your attention, for your interesting contributions. We've discussed 2 major future-related issues, 2 solutions which are definitely not simple. I'd like to continue the topic of AI and real-world evidence. It's a very topical issue in Poland. We have a lot of startups in this area in Poland. And I hope that we can organize a separate session for startups at the beginning of this year. And now I invite you to lunch, and I wish you further fruitful discussions. Thank you.